excited to talk about Scott Servais being relieved of his duties.
And welcome back to Baseball Barbacast. Why are we saying relieved of his duties, dog? Like, Servais got fired, okay? Maybe that word is a little bit too fierce, and maybe his tenure deserves a kinder phrase than canned. However, let's call it what it is. The manager of the Seattle Mariners, Scott Servais, was let go. He was laid off.
Service out.
End of service. Okay. I'm gonna start because you probably have a lot of things to say.
No, go ahead. Please set that stage, baby.
I'm gonna fire up producer Andrew Hartz. I want like a sound drop, like a old school sports talk radio sound drop. The multiple things can be true horn. All right. The multiple things can be true horn. Multiple things can be true. Scott Servais had a successful tenure as the manager of the Seattle Mariners. I believe this to be a fact. Also, I believe that this was the only thing the Mariners could have done right now. Not the only thing. Let me take that back. This was a wise move given the context of their current state, given how their season has gone over the last 2 months. I have no issue with the firing. However, I don't think it is fair to pretend like Scott Servais, who was there for 9 years, tied for the second longest tenured manager in baseball, was some sort of bumbling fool.
And I don't know if I would use the word wise move. Certainly an understandable move, right? I think we don't know if it's a wise move, and that we don't know. But I think what you just said is fair, and I think that, as you mentioned, this dude's been there since 2016. Dave Roberts and him are the two second longest tenure managers. Kevin Cash was there a year before. That's a long time. We see a lot of manager turnover. I believe the Mets have had 6 managers since Scott Servais was hired. That is including Carlos Beltran, to be fair. But the Padres have had 5. Like, teams are churning through these guys a lot now. And so if you can stick around, you're doing something right. And with all due respect to Bud Black and his situation in Colorado, which hasn't included a ton of winning, and he's still there, normally it's because you're winning. And the Mariners have been winning. Again, the big picture we'll get to, but they have the 8th most wins in baseball over the last 4 seasons. He has a lot of his teams overperformed their expected winning expected win percentage, which is usually a sign of probably some pretty good managing. And ultimately, until this year, they had accomplished a lot that they hadn't previously, including, of course, reaching the postseason, breaking the drought in 2022. And that is a season that, as bad as it has gotten over the last 2 years, does not disappear. It does not go away. It was still a very special experience for the fans, and Scott Servais was absolutely a huge part of that. But it brings us to why we are talking about this on the podcast today.
Just for context,
I'm
going to read the lineup from Scott Servais's first game in charge.
Oh, well, this was another big point I wanted to make, yes.
Okay. Leading off, Nori Aoki. Shortstop, Ketel Marte. Second base, Robinson Cano, Nelson Cruz, Kyle Seager, DH Franklin Gutierrez, first base, Adam Lind.
Goody was still playing?
That
like breaks my brain. Okay, yeah.
Chris Iannetta behind the dish. Leonis Martin in center, Daeho Lee and Seth Smith both pinch hit on opening day. And you might not believe this, Jordan, but Felix Hernandez, who I think you're familiar with, he went 6 and got the loss, allowing
that was
one
Felix's
run.
Like last good season.
So that's how long. I mean, we're talking about Ketel Marte, Mariner, and Franklin Gutierrez professional baseball player.
Hey, best hitter, bats second, right? Ketel Marte.
Heck yeah, but they knew.
In there. So, right. So just to bring this back to me personally, because I'm a me guy. This is about me. This is my podcast.
Can't spell Jordan Shusterman without an M and an E. Jordan Shusterman.
So again, like, Felix Hernandez makes me a Mariners fan, when I'm in high school.
But Scott Servais keeps me one.
Right. But, so I get a little, and then I get a little, that's like Eric Wedge, right? I don't really have, Eric Wedge means nothing to me. And then Lloyd McClennan's there for a couple of years. And then Scott Servais gets hired when I'm in Denmark when at the end of this is our junior year of college. I'm abroad in Copenhagen. I don't remember him getting hired because, again, it was like during the 2015 postseason, and I was watching Noah Syndergaard at 5 a.m. So, like, I genuinely don't really remember, like, oh, Scott Servais. But the reason why Scott Servais got hired originally, and this kind of ties in back to where we are today, is his relationship with Jerry Dipoto, which had extended back to them being teammates with the Rockies. They had worked together, I think, with the Rockies. They worked together in Anaheim. Servais was the farm director in Texas. He goes over to Anaheim, works for Dipoto with the Angels as in their front office for a while. And then when Dipoto gets hired at the end of the 2015 season, he says, all right, Servais is my guy, and he will be the manager. And which, okay, they have this long tenure. They completely, I mean, we talk about all the things that have changed, all these managers. You just mentioned that lineup. Think about how much roster turnover. When I'm tweeting out, the latest Jerry Dipoto trade, well, Scott Servais has been there for all of them.
And has to deal with all of them.
Right. He has had to manage all of those, not just learn people's names, which is already hard enough. Think about how many different guys have shuffled through that clubhouse throughout the season, spring training, all these offseason, all these guys. I think about how many calls he's had to make to new players they traded for, players they traded away, players, all these things, right? That is, talk about having to manage things. I mean, let alone the in-game stuff. That is a lot to deal with. And a lot of that was built on that relationship, that trust, that long-standing connection over years and years as baseball men who are the same age and kind of learn this game together, right? And so, as we get here to the end, why is he being fired now? If you haven't been watching the Mariners recently, they have arguably the best rotation in baseball, and they had a 10-game lead over the Astros, and now they don't. And they blew them.
No. Not that they just don't.
They're 5 games back. 5 games back, right now.
Which was an issue I had with Scott Servais' statements, and I don't want to get too ahead of myself. But in it, he said we were leading the competitive division just days ago. That is I like to say
I appreciate his statement. I think there was a lot in there where he took the high road, and he's very classy. But I agree that was definitely my least favorite part of the.
You were leading the worst division in baseball.
Yes, this year.
A month ago.
What we thought was going to be a competitive division, and instead the Rangers are bad. Anyway,
certainly top 6 in competitiveness.
So that's true. So they blow the division lead, but they're still in it. And remember, a week and a half ago, they sweep the Mets in dominating fashion, just absolutely pantsed the Mets. They crushed them on national television. And while at that point they're still, I think, tied with Houston, it was like, okay, like we stabilized it. The offense is looking better. Now it's just a fight, right? Now at this point, it's a fight. We got this big road trip coming up, including against 2 teams that are not very good. Let's see what can happen. And instead, they go 1-8 on the road trip in Detroit, Pittsburgh, in LA. They get swept in Detroit. They got blown out in the first game. They lose two close games. They go to Pittsburgh. They lose to Skeens. They lose on Saturday in more embarrassing fashion. They beat Jake Woodford on Sunday. And then they go to Dodger Stadium and they get outclassed in every sense. Some of those games were sort of close, but it was obvious who the better team was. It wasn't even remotely a question. And now they're 5 games back, and it seems like that was certainly the end. However, as we spin this to who the manager is going to be, which is Dan Wilson, a familiar face, the former catcher who has the 6th most games played in franchise history, someone who's been around the organization in multiple different roles, never in a coaching capacity, although he did fill in as a manager in AAA for a few games. He's been in the broadcast. He's around spring training all the time. He is Dan Wilson. Everybody likes Dan Wilson. But the most interesting thing about this decision is when it was first reported, they're naming Dan Wilson, that smells like Band-Aid ownership situation, right? You think, they just need an interim guy to get us through the rest of the season. Let's just bring in a fan favorite, and then we'll figure it out in the winter. That was, I think, everyone's first inclination. Is like, all right, this is a little strange, but we've seen versions of that before when guys are brought in midseason, and so it's like, okay, that's strange. However, when they actually officially announce it, Unfortunately, apparently after Scott Servais had found out about it via the news, which is embarrassing for everybody involved, whoever made that happen, they say that Dan Wilson is the permanent manager. And that suggests that this was a decision that was in the works for a lot longer than before they got swept by the Dodgers. And to that point, which makes sense because, again, they had blown the lead before then, that kind of changes the tone and really presents a fascinating next few months for this organization, because as they have capitulated over the last month, all the fan base has said, okay, someone's got to go. Someone's got to get fired. Oh, of course, everyone wants ownership to change. We know that's not happening. Is it going to be Jerry? Is it going to be Scott? Is it going to be both? It seems like DePoto is going to stay, but the choice to stick with Dan Wilson is a fascinating one. They bring in Edgar Martinez, replaces Jarrett DeHart, their hitting coach, also let go earlier this week. This is an interesting bet. And while everybody likes Dan Wilson, I don't really put much stock in people being like, he's never managed before. Like, how many times have we been saying that about managers? Sometimes that there's so many guys that haven't managed before that now get to manage, and like sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. And I just, that doesn't mean anything to me. To me, it's more about committing to him as the guy moving forward and what that will mean for the rest of this coaching staff.
And not doing a search.
Not doing a search, right? That is what makes this, I don't want to say concerning because I just don't know, but like that's what makes this a really big decision and what probably could ultimately mean the end for DePoto if it goes wrong, I would think. But maybe he has more job security than we think.
Not giving Wilson the interim tag is very interesting because it would be very easy and understandable to do that.
Yeah.
The Phillies did something similar with Rob Thompson, albeit earlier in the year, a couple of years ago. Rob did a really good job and they kept him around.
Obviously, we've seen versions of that. Yep.
Yeah, it can happen. It can go this way. But to just straight up be like, you're the guy is odd to me.
Totally.
I think if chances are they will lose members of the staff for next year. Now, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Who knows? And I the one thing I want to hammer home as an outsider, relatively, for the Mariners, is that they do a lot of things well. This is not a clueless organization. There are issues with the ideology coming from the top. Jerry DePoto's 54% comment that they just want to win 54% of games, I think highlights some of those issues. I think that also stems from ownership, lack of willingness to spend money, particularly on the offensive side. But what this org has done at the big league level with pitching is the envy of many other clubs in baseball. And that is why this season, the last 2 months, has been so frustrating, is because they do something very difficult outrageously well. Okay? Outrageously well. I think that bringing in a new voice could help. I think it could help. Well, what was clear to me, and I think to a lot of other people, is that the status quo was not tenable. They could not continue down that road with Scott Servais for the rest of the season and not at least try to shake things up.
Yeah, because while I understand people being like, the season's over, they're at 500 now. They're 5 games back of the Astros.
5.5.
5.5.
They have a worse record than Tampa.
Yeah, right. I mean, again, like it's bad, and their playoff odds are, I think, down to like 10 or 15%. But hey, you still have these guys going out there. I mean, I've said this over the last 2 months. You still got a pretty good chance to win every time you go out there because Brian Wu is your 5 starter. You know, like you still have that, and so in that theory, in that sense, and the names in the lineup don't look that bad. And so if you could just get some sort of momentum and some sort of change, and whether it's because of Dan Wilson or not, like who knows, but you have to try and at least change something. And that I totally understand with. I think, again, bigger picture, longer question, longer term, the big picture thing is, does ownership actually want to change anything more than this? If this team continues to flounder, finishes below 500, I mean, that would just be such a departure from this team that won 88, 90 games over the last 3 seasons, regardless of where you reach in the postseason. And then ultimately, if you do decide to move on from DePoto, if and when that happens, how do you make sure that the things that are going really well Obviously, the pitching. Obviously, recently, the draft and development of young high school players. Now we haven't seen those guys crest at the big league level yet, but there's a reason this team was somehow managed to immediately draft its way back into the top of the farm system rankings and draft guys that you are immediately able to trade for Randy Arozarena and stuff like that. Like, they're doing a lot right. And so if you are going to totally shake it up, how do you ensure that a lot of those things continue to work? So it's a big decision. It is very weird. I don't know. I still haven't totally processed it. They return home. They have a 3-game set at home against the Giants this weekend. I guess we'll hear from Dan Wilson for the first time later today. So I guess that'll be interesting for sure. But it sucks. I think Scott Servais was pretty cool. I enjoyed his tenure. I think he had a lot of really high moments, and I totally understand it. Getting to this point, it's unfortunate. But I will certainly remember him fondly because he's the guy. I mean, that's who I know as the manager, and so I will definitely think back on him in a positive way for sure.